How many of you think you have to do data and analysis before you dive into figuring out what your housing problems and solutions are? How many? Have we left that impression with you this morning? You got to do your homework before you dive in and build something? I hope so. There's good lessons to be learned from that research and that effort. So, audience, ask away.
All right, if you ask a question, you get lunch. If you don't ask a question, you don't get lunch. Dan, you get over here.
First of all, I want to congratulate Jason on what he's doing. I think it's really innovative, creative, and it's something that has been long needed, particularly in the work that many of us do, which raises the question to the others of you here. Many of the programs that we as a nonprofit organization community have used for years and years are designed at building houses. They're designed at building what we traditionally do. And I would really be interested at what point and how do we create an environment where there is some research and development money to try to think outside the box and actually create other ways of doing construction, other ways of building communities, so that we can ultimately save more money and be more cost effective in some of the small communities that we work in. There are solutions for this, but we can't do it in traditional ways. It has to be done, and you've invested, what did you say, $250,000 or more in what you've done, and that's just for one small segment of the housing market, and so I'd like to open that up to you guys.
Very bluntly, it's public resources for R&D are evaporating. And they weren't robust to begin with, whether it's R&D for bench-based research or whether it's R&D to help figure out what new tools can be created that public funds can assist with. That R&D that you speak of, which I think is very, very, very critical to this and the innovation that we hope can be driven for rural communities to address their rural housing needs. It's going to have to come from community foundations, from local tax base, from local leadership, and there may be some pieces from the public sector, whether it's a planning grant from CDBG or from HUD or from any other federally funded or state-funded agency or entity maybe can match, but those public resources for planning and research are shrinking, and that's why this becomes such a local leadership dilemma. Is you've got the issue, you've got the challenge, the public resources that once existed are thinning, and so how are you going to collectively as a community come forward and figure out how to finance all of this? I think nonprofits, community foundations, city councils, county commissioners, they've got to come together and they've got to figure out the solution and then see if there are some smaller amounts from federal and state government that can assist.
I would add to that, again, from our perspective, we're really the conveners. We're about how do you have these dialogues. And what's interesting about that is how quickly, when we're having these discussions, even the community members fall back to very traditional models. So a good example is the rent rates. And immediately when we talk about new housing, rural communities do have a depressed rental rate, but it's also, again, that expectation. So suddenly you talk about market value, and market value is not what market value is now. It's kind of what that would look like in the future based on elevated, infrastructure or inflation rates or construction. And when we even try to have creative conversations about what that could look like, immediately we start brainstorming and we tend to go back to what we know. We tend to go back to, well, housing looks like this. So I would also flip that not only to being a resource conversation, but how about when we're discussing the needs of our community or when we're discussing what those might look like, how can we encourage authentic brainstorming even as a community, taking resources off the table. A lot of times we limit ourselves by what is or is not available, what is matched or what isn't matched. And how can we start actually having some of that brainstorming? I mean, he didn't just sit here and come up with that without some level of brainstorming, from a creative what if. So again, challenging those more traditional models as we proceed.
In this, I'm not exactly who you're going to ask the question to, but I want to say this. One of the things we pride ourselves as a private company is that we don't believe we will fail at anything because we take everything as an experiment. And so we take lessons learned when we try something that doesn't work and we apply it. And I think one of the things that you're seeing from organizations like this, Public Square is a really great example, is that it's time to start experimenting, it's time to start working on new ideas and stop having the focus on the research. We need to do our research, but stop buying the studies and stop trying to figure out where you go to get more and more studies, and let's actually take projects and let's work together in public-private partnerships and figure, even if it's just all public partnerships. I'm not trying to shove myself in here, but start working together. These people have knowledge and insights. They've got programs that you can get into and you can follow and you can be a part of the great experiment of housing options. And so it's time to start taking action and jumping in, just like we're doing on the private side.
We've got a question over here, Sue.
My question is, how do you convince the stakeholders and the county and city officials that we do need to get together and come up with the hat?
Who's this to?
Anybody.
Who said the hat?
Well, I'll start with that. It goes back to what I said earlier. If you have, I think you have to make sure you have a team of people that think there's a problem. If they don't think they have a problem, you're not going to get any buy-in. You're not going to get any participation. And then I challenge you back that if you can't get enough people around the table that think you have a problem, do you have one? So I think it takes education if you think there is. And if you can't, sometimes you move on to a different project.
And I think another thing you have to think about in that inclusive community setting, where you have the discussions, is what if we don't do something? What does our community look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if we don't intersect with a strategy and a plan and experiment? And I think that picture in and of itself will help drive the commitment.
We have two questions, one here and then one right next to him. Yeah, go ahead, put the mic.
I'm sorry, this is Ray Jones, I'm from Augusta. My question, I guess, is for Jason. In terms of construction methodology, or how you put these together, currently are you stick-built? Are you pre-built walls and roofs and things like that? How are you doing that, number one? And number two, I know we found to some extent that during the aftermath of Katrina, it was better to actually do a lot of the house building in a factory environment where you could actually build segments of an apartment and then transport them and put them together like building blocks where they're already finished when they go together. We don't have that, I don't believe, in Kansas. I don't believe there's anybody in Kansas who's doing that. And again, could we look at maybe a private, government-private partnership that would allow something like that to happen, because something like that would indeed provide jobs. And there are a lot of localities that don't have the skilled tradesmen to build an apartment. And in this way, you can make it happen and make it happen very quickly.
Yeah, I would welcome the opportunity to figure out how to do fabricated housing, to have some type of a way to ship the components in and modularize apartments. I mean, that would be incredible. The long history of real estate development, that road is littered with people that have tried that experiment and failed, but I'm not scared of experimentation. It is a challenge. We're stick-built, we're wood frame construction, we're from the ground up. We don't modularize anything at present. We just come in and build it from the ground up, which is why it's more expensive in rural communities, and the further away you get from a labor base like Wichita, the more difficult it becomes. And I'm not here today to tell you we've got it all figured out. I'm here today to tell you we've got, I don't think you expect me to, we've got a model, and we are thrilled to try to experiment with stuff like that. If we could find a developer, it wouldn't be us to go into the modularization business, but if we found somebody with that skills and expertise that could work with us and build manufacturing facilities and communities, and we could add jobs and just not housing to those communities, I'd much prefer to do that than to bring in traveling crews from other communities. I mean, even the Wichita project, it was big enough, we brought in traveling framing crews from Texas. I wish we could have brought more people from Wichita, it just wasn't enough people. So I welcome the opportunity to look at those options. If somebody else can get that conversation started and find people who are interested in partnering, we'll throw our hat in the ring. Because right now, what we've got to do is just work within the constraints we've got, which is doing the ground up construction. Does that answer?
In many of our local counties, we have 2 or 3 or more schools with, communities, cities within a school system. Have you utilized HAT and Public Square to involve more than one city when they're all relatively fairly close? And has it worked? Will it work? What's your comments?
This particular housing process, because it's a pilot, we're investigating, it did not occur in this particular housing pilot. On the flip side of that, our community development side, as I mentioned, we're in roughly about 26, 27 communities, which equals closer to 60 towns. So yes, from a community development, from a citizen engagement and community conversation perspective, we do have some experience in how you convene multiple communities. I will be honest, it has worked in some and it has not in others. There are some factors to consider. In one community, everyone agreed they needed to work together, and then in certain elements, they completely did not. And there's only so much you can do from citizen-driven level if indeed maybe the institutions within those communities are actually not implementing what was being said. From a housing perspective, we did actually, although we did not involve multiple communities in those particular endeavors, in both cases, both had conversations with surrounding communities so that that dialogue remained open, fully knowing that it's not an inclusive endeavor, that it is very much exclusive. It's trying to be inclusive to all of those surrounding areas. So it's partially made up by what the citizens can do or those network levels in conjunction with how the institutions allow that information to be processed and to move through.
Go here and then over there next.
Hey, Patty, Debbie, Liz, Jason, Linda. My question is I feel fortunate to be having this conversation. We've had this conversation, convened about it for 10 years, as long as I've been in this conversation. But my question for you is, what is the silver bullet solution? We can talk rehab, we can talk multifamily, but I think until we can finally figure out a solution, we have to figure out what that silver bullet is. I think for the suburbs, the silver bullet to me, it's easy to see. It's retail development, it's very vanilla, bland neighborhoods. But for our rural communities, I really don't think we're getting anywhere until we figure out what our silver bullet is. So I'm just curious what you think that silver bullet would be.
I don't think it exists. I don't think there is a silver bullet. I think this looks different in each community, each county, each region. I think about some of the things that we've heard from the presenters today, some of the stories that have been shared, the anecdotal information. Humboldt, they had a realtor list of 40, 45 properties that hadn't moved in years. Well, first of all, they didn't even realize that until they dove in and did the diagnosis of what was going on. Second of all, now they're making a commitment to rehab those properties with tools from the government, and that's what we have, is we have those great tools. But what about taking it one step further in that, everybody knows about Habitat for Humanity, and somehow we seem to stay in our box and say, well, we don't have a Habitat for Humanity in our community. Well, create your own. It doesn't have to be called Habitat for Humanity. It can be called Habitat for Humboldt. And use grant, some of the, leverage the grant funds with private funds, with employer investment and volunteer labor and community foundation effort, and create that rehab process in a public-private partnership. And that's not where our minds take us. As Liz said, we go right back to what we've always known and what we've always seen in our communities. But it's going to take that creative process and that creative push in every community to find the silver bullet for that community. And there is no single answer. And it's going to look different in each place.
That's great. So what I'm gonna do is, we're getting close to lunch. We're gonna have one more question. If you have questions, jot it down. But before we go to lunch, everyone on the panel is going to get a chance to have a final word before we go to lunch. But we have one more question over here before we go to the final panel comments.
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Tice, member of Philip Tice Architects. Is this on?
Yeah, speak into the louder, Greg.
Okay.
There's that better? Okay.
Yeah.
Greg Tice with Spangler Phillips Tice Architects, and I wanted to speak a little bit about the construction question that you asked. And it's a story that I hope doesn't upset too many people, but it's kind of an intriguing concept. My firm also does assisted living housing in rural communities, and in fact, we did one in Lyons, Kansas, and a couple other communities, about 18 to 24 unit facilities. And it's for a private developer here in the state of Kansas. But what that has since led to is that developer has teamed up with another development company and teamed up with a group that's gotten involved with what's called CB5 funding, which is a government program to help bring in jobs to communities. And I don't know if it exists in Kansas, honestly, but right now we've taken that same concept of an 18 to 24 unit facility, and we're doing 50 of them in Alabama and Tennessee, and starting to do some in Texas as well. Well, CB5 funding, what it does is it allows investment from outside the country to come in, and if you create jobs, then you get citizenship into the United States, basically. It's my limited understanding. I don't want to speak too much about it because I don't know all the specifics. But, so the Chinese have taken advantage of that, and a lot of the funding that is building these 50 to 100 assisted living facilities is coming from the Chinese. So what the Chinese have told us is that, well, it's our money funding these projects, so we want you to use our building materials. And so, we have guys from our company that are talking with the Chinese and saying that it started out, they just wanted us to use their steel. So we said, okay, we'll redesign these because these were stick-built construction, and we'll just change them to metal stud construction. Well, then it kind of evolved, and it evolved to the degree that, no, we want to build the entire wall. And we'll ship over the entire wall with the metal studs, with the drywall, with the electrical, with the windows already in place. And we were like, okay, is that even feasible to do logistically and economically? And they came back and they said it was going to be, I think it was $800,000 to do that. And the cost on this project was $500,000. We said, well, the economics don't work. So what they said is, okay, we'll do it for $500,000. And so that's what's going on right now. And so what they're looking at doing is shipping over completely completed walls. And we don't have it all figured out yet, but those are the out-of-the-box kind of things that are going on as a result of some of what started as a private kind of enterprise and development. And it's not happening in any facility in Kansas that we're working on right now, but that is what kind of the next step is. And so when you talk about not being able to have the expertise to do these in some areas, there's other options that just keep thinking outside the box or keep looking at different alternatives that may not be quite there yet, but it doesn't necessarily have to be too far around the corner either.
Great, thank you for sharing that example. So that's one of the things I'm excited about, all the different expertise, different backgrounds here in this room. We'll again have a chance after lunch to come back for a broader conversation. So panel, what closing comments, pithy closing comments do you have for the room?
One of the behaviors in rural communities after a career of working with and for rural communities that I would love to modify is the thinking and decision-making in a vacuum that I see occur time and time again. Here is a convening of resources and communities. And as each of you go back and maybe begin to tackle this housing challenge, check in with people you met here, with the resources that you were introduced to. Get more minds at the table and think in collaborative cooperation. Rural communities need to reach out to each other and reach out to the resource providers. That's what HIAC is all about. That's what collaborative cooperation is all about. That's what Public Square is all about. You know, don't make isolated decisions in a vacuum. Reach out to each other and reach out to the resource providers, and you'll come to a better decision-making, solution-driven process.
I have to agree with Patty a lot on that. I just want to kind of go back to a little bit about, a lot of them question, you know, they give us the perfect hat, what it looks like. There is no perfect hat. Each one's different. As we were talking about earlier about the Lions project, where Lions went from regular housing rehab to doing rentals because that was their biggest issue, and it really wasn't. But they came in a perceived idea of housing rehab was what they wanted. Until they sat with the group and we came back in and said, your data that you gave us really doesn't say that. Well, then part of one of the other issues that we deal with on something to do with on rentals is rentals get, if I can put it to, I'm trying to figure out how tactfully to say that, get to the spot where they are that need rehabs because a lot of the landlords do not take care of the properties. Even though they get money for it, they don't. So part of the deals that we worked with it on this one for the City of Lions is, we said, okay, we'll work with you on rentals, but you have to put something in place so that we know from 5 years from now that these rental units aren't gonna look the same as what they were when we started. We put the rent freeze agreements, we put things like that in there, but a tendency is, if they come in and get money, they don't do anything anyway. So they did it as a twofold thing. They required all the landlords to be able to put in so much money into the property. What we did is rehabilitation, but they also put into the guidelines that each year, every one of those rental units we came in and did would have a inspection done by an inspector by the city, and it had to still stay within the codes. And if it didn't stay within the codes, then they could come in and penalize the landlord and require part of that money to be paid back. That was what we originally gave to the property. So those were some of the, and those are some of the things that a lot of people don't think about, but we've been working in the process long enough that there's lots of different ideas that you can come up with, and some of them aren't gonna be totally palatable to everybody. But I think it's things that you gotta look outside that box that hasn't ever been done before. And I can tell you, the smaller the community, the harder it is to work with a council, whether it be a commissioner or a city council, because that's my neighbor, or that's my mother-in-law, or that's my brother-in-law. You have to take that away from there, which is the hardest thing for us to come in and do, is you have to make the regulations for everybody. You can't pick and choose who you want to have, and if you really want us to get involved, that's what you're gonna have to do. And that's what, in a way, when we go out and do our site visits and stuff, we tell the real truth when we come in and sit in a meeting. If we think your community needs cleanup and it's trashy, we're gonna tell you what it is, And 9 times out of 10 will point out which house it is. Well, yeah, they knew it, they just haven't done anything with it. Well, if you're not willing to do anything with it, don't come asking for federal dollars or state dollars to come bail you out of something you're not willing to touch to start with. So that's part of what we do is this analysis is make that step.
I think in closing, I want to hope that you take away that we do want to partner with you, but we are not the silver bullet, and I agree there is no silver bullet, but we want to partner and we want to work. A couple years ago, I opened up the CDBG program to just not, we always just did rehab and demolition. And I opened it up to try to give more opportunities to do what we call reconstruction. So there's some things that I opened up. People have looked at rehabbing of upper story units and those kind of things that we couldn't do before. So I tried to open it up to do my part in opening up the program to provide more opportunities. It is federal money, I'm tied. We can't do new construction, I'm tied. But I guess what I want to say is that you do the hat and you do a good job with your community in doing the hat, and we will do the best job we can to partner with you, to help you. But until you do get your skin in the game, be a partner of that, it's hard for us to provide any opportunities for you. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is do the hat, bring it to us in the HIAC, and let us partner with you, trying to help think outside the box and come up with a way to solve your problems.
I think fundamentally we're seeing a culture shift in our communities, whether it's urban, whether it's rural, suburban. It's kind of that whole reimagined American dream. We really, if you've listened to some of the focus today, it's on rentals, or it's on multifamily units, or it's on some of these various components that before may have had a negative connotation. We really have witnessed in many of the communities in which we work that it's back to that creativity, but it's also acknowledging that there is a culture shift that has to occur. An example being those, depressed rental rates. How do we suddenly realize that that is no longer the case? How do we bring in higher end rental housing even into a rural community, and people are willing to pay for that? And then how are they explaining that to the other people in the community who didn't think it was a good idea? So I guess in closing, if I were to say what takeaways we would have from these discussions, it really roots down to that idea of what we have always looked at is maybe not what we should look at going forward. There's a complete respect and nod to the history of how we got to this point, but we also see some of these elements changing. We see more people, young people moving back to rural communities or choosing to live a rural lifestyle. We do see rural communities wanting to take the idea of housing and begin turning it around. Whether it's through rehab, whether it's through new construction, whether it's through rental or home ownership. And so it's really about how do we embrace that and continue to move those dialogues forward. And the idea that it's not always just who we think should be sitting at the table. If we're looking at our community across the board, really there's a whole lot of people that could be engaged in these particular conversations to make sure that it's a community buy-in rather than just from one sector, from one side of the conversation.
First of all, I'm glad that the last question was actually a little bit of a cross-audience conversation, because that's what we're going to do when we come back from lunch, is we're going to have an open forum where people can say, hey, I want to tell you something I've seen in my community, and not just ask questions. We'll be up here, but we want you to talk to each other and have that after lunch. I'm also glad that Greg brought up what he did, because I know that he and his firm, as architects, you're there to do what's best for your clients, and I know that they've struggled with this whole concept that's been introduced to them, and that first of all, we won't have any Chinese walls in our apartments, just so you know. And I know that's not what Greg was promoting, and I can tell you what's in Greg's heart. Greg is saying, by God, if they can do it, we can do it. This country is founded upon innovation and on community, and we're not going to be out-innovated. And so if there's a way to create modular housing, if there's a way to cut money and there's a way to do it, we're going to figure it out. And it starts here, and it starts with these conversations, and it starts with our network here in Kansas, working together to figure things out.